Hi everyone, it's Dr. Kate, and it's great to see you all. I can't see you, but if you're watching this, you can see me, um, and my cat, who may make an appearance. She's sitting right over there. Anyway, this is our last week of class, and you have two readings for this week and that's it. And you've got a discussion board that's due Tuesday by 11:59 p.m., and your last unit exam is due Friday by 11:59 p.m. And I can't accept late exams for this last exam because grades are due really quickly. So please be sure to get that in on time. If it's going to be an issue in some way, please contact me ASAP and we'll see if we can figure something out. So as we wrap up this week, I wanted to say just a couple things about last week's discussion board and then talk a bit about the readings for this week. So last week you all talked in the discussion board a lot about same-sex marriage, and it seemed like the consensus of the class is that there aren't really any good arguments against it. Now, some of you might feel differently, but you didn't write about it, so I don't know that you did. And a few of you sort of dug into Candace Swami's argument and saw the sort of issues with marriage and marriage as a thing that gives rights. So I like to think of marriage as like a basket of rights, and I talked about this in the last video lecture, that you choose to share with one other person. So, and that's what a lot of the arguments around same-sex marriage are about. Like, everybody should have access to this basket of rights. So let's make sure that people in same-sex relationships do as well. And that argument is quite persuasive from a sort of an equity, equal rights standpoint. If we understand marriage as a legal institution, right? Religions can make their own choices about this, but if we're talking about that basket of rights, then it needs to be equitably shared. Candace Swami argues, right, that basket of rights doesn't protect the way people think it does, and that's the real problem. And so the fight for same-sex marriage extends an institution that for marginalized people has never been an institution that actually kept them safe, right? So her arguments in her piece about how marriage doesn't ensure that you get to keep your children, right? As CPS takes, Child Protective Services takes children from poor families and families of color at a much higher rate than white middle class or upper class families, and that marriage doesn't protect you from that kind of state intervention. Marriage doesn't guarantee immigration rights, right? So her argument is that rather than fight for same-sex marriage, we should fight to dismantle that institution as a way of distributing rights, and we should think of another way to do it. So it's sort of pushing us to think critically about whether, like, how we want to organize the world. And I think that's really important. A number of you pointed out, very importantly though, that marriage is more than just that basket of rights. For a lot of people, it's emotional, it's symbolic, it's part of building community and family. And Candace Swami doesn't really touch on that, and that's really true, that she doesn't really touch on that. And that's worth thinking about, right? Are those of us who are married or want to get married, are we just suffering from some false consciousness and we aren't woke enough? I think, no, I think that our desires come from somewhere and they're real. So if you choose to write a response to one of the exam questions about same-sex marriage, make sure that you are tuned into sort of the complexities of Candace Swami's argument, if you choose to accept that in the final. So for this week, I've asked you to read a couple of things. First is a report about issues facing trans people of color in particular in the prison system. And the reason I asked you to do this is to sort of take our discussion of politics that has thread through the course, politics and representation and inequality, and look at how those things come together and put a particularly marginalized population at sort of the knife edge of power, right? So you'll read in this about how stereotypes and assumptions about people who are gender or sexual minorities, how that can make people targets for the police and targets for prosecutors, and ultimately end up in prisons and jails at much higher rates than cisgender or heterosexual people. or white people. So this report is sort of the state of affairs. And in the discussion board, I want you to pull out a couple issues that you see as sort of really troubling, or things that are interesting or surprising, or that you think need to be highlighted, and talk about those a little bit. And then offer some kind of, like, is there something we could do? And none of us are policymakers yet, so this is like your dream board. What would you, so rather than being hemmed in by, oh, that's too expensive, or I don't know if people go for that, think about really critically about what the world you want would look like. So when we think about same-sex marriage, for example, is the world we want one where everybody can get married? Or is the world we want one where everybody has health care whether they're married or not? Right? So thinking sort of more critically about these institutions that so many of us take for granted. And one of the institutions we take for granted is prisons and jails. And we take those for granted as the way of solving a lot of social problems, right? When something goes wrong, we're like, well, who did it and how do we get them in jail? Let's put them in a cage. The United States has about 5% of the world's population and holds about 25% of the world's incarcerated people. So we have more people in prisons and jails and under state supervision in the United States than any place ever in any time in history. Is that because people in the United States are really bad people? No, it's because of how we've chosen to use prison and jails as a solution to larger social problems. So for example, one of the explanations for the huge rise in people who are incarcerated was the drug war of the 1980s, and that continues today, right? This making drug use a punishable offense that puts you in jail. We could do something else, right? We could say, oh, this drug use is your behavior in some other way is a problem, and so we're going to try and help you not be addicted to drugs, right? So maybe we have drug treatment programs. Maybe we address the root causes of it. Why is it that people get addicted to drugs? If you think about it, there's a zillion reasons, right? As a way of self-medicating when you don't have access to healthcare and you have depression, for example, because you want to fit in. Well, why don't you fit in? Like, what socially happens that produces this sense of outsiderness, and how do drugs how do they fix that? So we could think sort of critically about the root causes of drug addiction and try and sort of make amends for those causes, and then also help people in the throes of addiction. I've been addicted to things. It's challenging, right? But we can treat people, and people can get better. We could treat it as a public health problem, but we don't. We treat it as a carceral problem. Like, how do we get all these people in cages? And that's really damaging for people and for communities. And so the reading for this week is going to ask us to think about alternatives to that through the lens of looking at how gender and sexual minorities in particular are impacted by the system. So that's what that report is about. And then the last reading is an interview with some activists talking about what they call an abolitionist future. And by this they mean, how do we imagine a world without prisons? How do we imagine and make a world that's about freedom instead of cages? So that's that last reading, and I assigned it to you because I wanted you to get a chance to see how some of these sort of more radical ideas help people imagine a different future. So, as always, you don't have to agree with anything that you read in this class. You can poke all the holes you want in it. I'm interested to see what you think after you work through the text. But remember to take them on their own terms, and to be open to some of the more radical ideas. It just helps us all push our thinking and imagine new things. So, as always, if you have any questions or concerns, or you want to talk through the readings on the phone or through a video chat like this, I'm always open to that. And my week is yours, so send me an email if you want to chat. And otherwise, I will see you on the flip side. Thanks.